I remember like it was yesterday. I just made my way into Jerusalem to make sacrifice. It was the Passover. And I was just doing what I'd been taught to do, what all Jews, males, were taught to do. I had taught my children, Adolphus and Rufus, early about that. So I was trying to be a good example. I went to the city to make my sacrifices, and lo and behold, everybody seemed to be around this one main street. It's almost like there was a parade going on. Apparently, Roman soldiers were taking some men to be crucified. I tried to make my way up into the crowd to see what was going on, but I didn't want to get too close. I didn't want to get involved. There were a couple of men, and they seemed to be making their way through cross beams, but there was this one man that they were driving, and man, he was beat up and he was bleeding, and he fell a couple of times underneath the weight of the cross they were making him carry. All the people were screaming and hollering, and I really didn't know what was going on. I'd just come into the area, so I had no clue what was happening. And I was trying to make my way back out of the group, and about that time, that man fell underneath that cross one more time. And one of the Roman soldiers happened to be close to me. And he turned around and he pointed at me and he said, "Grab his cross." And I stood there and looked at him for a moment, and I thought, why me? Why me? Maybe I was just convenient. Maybe he turned and looked and figured I could handle it. I don't know. But I looked at him and kind of shook my head. I didn't want any part of it. And he looked at me again and he pointed his sword at me and he said, "Pick up the cross." So I got down underneath the cross beams, picked it up on my shoulder, began to stand up. The man who had been struggling underneath the cross began to stand up next to me, and about that time I turned and I looked and I realized that he had a crown of thorns that was stuck into his head. I began to look at him again, and I saw that there was blood all over him, and I began to realize that they must have had him, and they must have scourged him, and they must have beat him. And I wondered, what kind of man could this fella be? What was it that he did that brought all this on? Began to drag the cross down through the crowd, and we began to make our way up. We were headed towards a place that was infamously known as the place of the skull. And as we walked along, I began to get a different sense. The people were crying out and saying horrible things, but I didn't sense that from this man. Not at all. In fact, I began to sense that he cared about me. In the midst of all that was going on, I began to focus on him, and I really didn't see the Roman soldiers anymore, and I didn't really see the people anymore, or hear them anymore. I began to focus on this man. All the way up that hill we went, until finally we came to the point that made the Roman guard satisfied, and I dropped the cross down, and they shoved me out of the way, and I watched as they put that man on the cross. They took a hammer and they began to nail spikes into his hand and to his feet. And it wasn't like I hadn't seen it done before, but there was something about this. Something that just wrenched my gut. Began to slip back into the crowd again, but I stood by close enough to watch. And I watched as they took the cross and they began to stand it up, and they dropped it into that hole, and everybody just kind of said a little bit, "Ooh," as it hit the ground. And I watched this man shudder on the cross. I quietly began to ask the people around me what was going on. Who was this man? They said his name was Jesus of Nazareth. I'd heard that name. I'd heard that name not for bad things, but for good things. And so I began to ask a couple of people, why was he being crucified? And I began to get this answer and get that answer. And then I began to notice that people were looking at me strangely. So I stopped asking questions, and I just kind of made my way around the back end. But I stayed close enough to where I could watch. Slowly but surely, I watched as that man died on that cross. I heard some of the things that he said, apparently to his mother and to a couple of others that were there. I listened to some of the other people as they said things. And the crowd grew very quiet. And then suddenly, storm clouds began to come up. And I heard him say, "It is finished." And then he bowed his head. And lightning began to strike across the sky, and a storm blew up, and the wind began to blow. And as I made my way to some shelter, I began to realize I just watched a good man die. A man who died for something that he obviously had not done. I stayed in the city for a couple of days. Heard more about this Jesus. When the first day of the week came along, began to hear some rumors that they had taken this Jesus and buried him and put him in a tomb and rolled a big stone in front of it. And apparently some of the high priests, the other religious leaders were really worried about him. I guess maybe he'd been encroaching on their turf. So they'd gone to Pilate and asked for guards to watch the tomb. And apparently, in the midst of all of that, stone had been rolled away and his body was gone. And everybody was trying to figure out what had happened. Then I began to hear more rumors, more stories. This man was alive. He rose from the dead. Before I left the city, it was rife with speculation. And I began to think back to what it was like when I was carrying that cross next to him. And suddenly I realized that some of the blood from the cross where he had been carrying it, some of his blood, had found its way onto my cheek. And apparently the last couple of days I hadn't noticed it. So I hadn't washed it off. And I began to think about the way he looked at me, and I began to think about the things that he said. And I began to put some things together, and suddenly I realized he was more than a man. I didn't understand everything at the time. But I realized that God had sent at least a prophet, maybe more. He died on that cross. After I left Jerusalem, talked to some other people, and I began to realize who he must have been. This man, this Jesus of Nazareth, he wasn't just a man. He was the Son of God. And when he died on that cross, he died in my place. He took my sin. When they nailed him onto that cross, they nailed my sin on that cross. And in fact, when they were doing that, at the very time they were doing that, they were actually sacrificing the Passover lamb back in the temple, but that wasn't the lamb. The lamb that they were putting on the cross was the real lamb. And the greatest thing about it all was that he didn't stay dead. That first day of the week, when the soldiers saw that the stone had been rolled away, we heard about how afraid they were, and I couldn't hardly believe that. How could a Roman soldier be afraid of anything? We found out the reason because that man they put on the cross rose from the dead and walked out of that tomb. He was alive. I began to tell my sons about what had happened. I began to tell others about what had happened. And I began to realize as the days went by what God had allowed me to be part of. I tried to hide from it. But there was no need to hide from it. Because God made me part of his gospel story. Jesus is alive. And if you give your life to him, you give back to him that which he took, that which he created, that which he made. You give yourself to him, knowing that he took your sins, bore them on the cross. You become part of his gospel story too. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. You know, I remember hearing something from the time I was a child. It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. You know what? Sunday's here.